We just, over the last few minutes, literally shot out a boat, a drug-carrying boat, a lot of drugs in that boat.
At exactly 2:48 a.m. in the Caribbean darkness, 98 high-speed boats surged from the reef corridor, engines screaming like a predator pack on the move. They believed they were invisible, slipping into U.S. waters unchallenged. What they didn't know, as they crossed the narrowing sea strip, they sailed straight into a trap, a meticulously prepared maritime killbox set by U.S. naval forces. Aboard the surface ship, a team of Navy SEALs held their breath. Above them, a P-8 Poseidon's radar scanned the movement with surgical precision. Why did so many boats appear at once? Who let such a fleet approach the American littoral? And how did U.S. forces anticipate the move so precisely? The answers lie in the shadows of a $100 million cocaine empire run by the cartel known as La Corona Del Mare. This was not a mere smuggling run. It was a full-scale naval-style operation, and the U.S. strategy was to stop it at sea before it could reach our shores. If you're intrigued by covert operations at sea, fast-paced tracking, and the hidden web of the drug war, hit subscribe to the Military Power channel now, because what unfolds next will change how you view naval interdiction forever. Hours before the ambush detonates in the Caribbean killbox, the story really begins with a faint, ugly blur on a radar screen. Far out over the water, a maritime patrol aircraft switches to synthetic aperture radar, and suddenly the ocean is no longer just waves. It becomes a detailed map of moving shapes. Among the normal traffic, operators notice a long, thin smear of returns, sitting dozens of nautical miles off the main shipping lanes. It does not look like a single cargo ship or a classic go-fast boat. Instead, it looks like a cluster of many small targets flying in close formation. For analysts, that instantly feels wrong. Synthetic aperture radar, which acts like a giant scanner from the sky, can pick up small, fast objects even in rough seas. So when that smear refuses to break apart into individual contacts, they know something is hiding there. In recent years, the U.S. Coast Guard and its partners have seen cartels push the limits at sea, seizing loads of 6,000 pounds of cocaine or more in single interdictions across the Caribbean, with values running into hundreds of millions of dollars. Those cases prove one thing: the days of small, random runs are over. This time, what appears on the screen is even more aggressive. As the aircraft circles and updates the picture, the smear begins to resolve into a wedge, like an arrowhead cutting toward the north. There are too many hulls moving too tight at too even a speed to be normal fishing traffic. When the track is relayed to the Joint Operations Center, FBI analysts and Coast Guard officers see the same pattern. This is not a handful of smugglers gambling on a lucky night. It is a mass deployment, a swarm built to overwhelm any single patrol cutter. That formation changes everything, because it bends the normal rules of detection at sea. One or two speedboats can be chased, forced to stop, even sunk if they refuse. A formation that behaves like a mechanized unit on water is different. It can scatter, sacrifice a few boats, and still push most of the cargo through. Quietly, planners accept a hard truth. Chasing each contact is impossible. The only way to win is to make the entire formation sail into a prepared trap. Yet even this strange radar picture is only the surface. Behind that wedge of boats lies a cartel that has spent years studying sensors, patrol routes, and weak points in U.S. coverage. And the fleet, now moving through the dark, is only the first clear sign that their new method is finally in play. But if the radar revealed only the shape of the threat, then who created a fleet that could move like a naval unit while staying hidden in plain sight? La Corona Del Mare does not look like a cartel when you first study its pattern. It looks like a small, private navy. On paper, it barely exists. Just a trail of shell companies and offshore accounts. But in satellite images and radar tracks, it appears as a disciplined fleet. Intelligence officers describe a group that learned from every failed run in the Caribbean and Atlantic, watching how the U.S. Coast Guard and Navy moved, then redesigning its own vessels to slip between those patrol lines. Over the last decade, real cartels have already pushed into high-speed maritime tactics, swapping slow fishing boats for fast, go-fast craft powered by heavy outboards, a trend documented by the Coast Guard itself as seizures of cocaine at sea hit record levels. La Corona del Mare simply takes that logic to the extreme. Instead of a few boats, this network invests in waves of 80 to 100 ultralight speedboats at a time. Each one is built on a composite hull, a mix of fiber-reinforced plastics and other materials that are strong but very light. In naval construction, these composites are valued because they reduce weight and maintenance, yet they also tend to reflect less radar energy than thick metal plates, shrinking the vessel's radar footprint. For a cartel engineer, that is a gift. It means a small, dark hull can slice across the surface and from far away look like nothing more than sea clutter on a screen. La Corona del Mare turns those advantages into a playbook. Boats are launched from hidden coves and improvised yards along remote coasts, often at night or just before dawn, when sea and air temperatures confuse sensors. Instead of sending one risky shipment, the organization floods a corridor with dozens of nearly identical hulls. From above, that mass breaks into layered wedges, like armored columns on water, each line slightly offset to mask the next. Intelligence from real cases shows that when smugglers push large amounts of cocaine by sea, they can move several thousand pounds in a single run. And law enforcement has responded with huge interdictions, such as the joint British and US operation in the Caribbean that pulled about 6,000 pounds of cocaine off a single high-speed boat. La Corona del Mare scales that idea up, betting that quantity and formation will overwhelm any one ship. From the US point of view, that is the real danger. Traditional strategy assumes a patrol detects one suspicious boat, gives chase, and forces it to stop, surrender, or dump the load. However, when a formation behaves like a mechanized unit, every decision becomes harder. If a cutter locks onto one target, 10 others can fan out. If a helicopter drops low to mark a lead boat, the rest can scatter into shoals and reefs. Reports from recent US operations make clear that even with drones, patrol aircraft, and modern cutters, crews are already working at the edge of what they can cover as they face more and more fast boats and even narco subs in the same waters. Against a cartel that deliberately designs for mass and speed, simply chasing contacts turns into a losing game. This is why, inside planning rooms, analysts talk about La Corona del Mare not as a gang, but as an adversary that studies radar diagrams and patrol schedules the way a navy studies enemy fleets. Each new composite hull is another piece in a private armada. Each synchronized launch is a rehearsal in how to punch through a coastal shield and land millions of dollars in drugs on foreign shores. As this picture comes into focus, one conclusion overshadows the rest. If US forces try to hunt every single boat, they will always be one step behind. The only realistic way to beat a fleet built on speed and numbers is to make that entire fleet sail into a space where it cannot hide, cannot scatter, and cannot turn back. A trap so tight that all 98 boats are caught inside it at once. So if chasing this private navy is impossible, what kind of battlefield could the United States create to trap 98 boats moving at full speed? Long before the first shot is fired, the real battle moves to a map. In a dim operations room, US Navy planners study the coastline and reefs like a puzzle, searching for one place where speed stops being an advantage. They find it in a narrow reef corridor only about 14 nautical miles across, squeezed between two jagged lines of shallow water and crossed by awkward side currents. In open sea, a cartel speedboat can run, split, or circle back. Inside this corridor, the captain has almost no choices. If he tries to turn hard, the hull risks slamming into coral. If he slows too much, the current begins to push the boat sideways. The same water that once hid smugglers now becomes the walls of their prison. The idea of using geography against traffickers is not fantasy. For years, U.S. forces in the Caribbean have relied on choke points and reef lines to detect and intercept fast drug boats because the region is full of narrow passages that funnel maritime traffic into predictable lanes, something Coast Guard commanders have openly described when explaining major cocaine seizures at sea. In this case, the chosen corridor becomes the heart of a carefully built killbox, a three-dimensional cage drawn not with fences, but with coordinates. Once the killbox is defined, the question becomes, who stands where? At the center of the plan sits an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, the same type of multi-mission warship the U.S. Navy regularly uses in real counter-drug operations alongside the Coast Guard. These ships have advanced radar, helicopters, and enough deck space to act as a mothership for boarding teams. On its stern, a detachment of Navy SEALs prepares to move. Their job not to sink a fleet, but to break it apart and take people alive. Farther out, a literal combat ship holds the outer ring, sitting just beyond the reefs, ready to catch any boat that somehow slips past the first layers. Closer to the edges of the corridor, two Coast Guard cutters take position on the likely escape routes. This interagency pattern matches real Caribbean task forces, where Coast Guard ships, Navy vessels, and aircraft work together under a unified command to hit smugglers in depth. The cutters bring law enforcement authority, experienced boarding teams, and smaller interceptors that can sprint after anything that tries to break away at the last second. Overhead, a P-8 Poseidon circles high, using its radar and sensors to watch the entire corridor in real time, similar to how these aircraft have supported anti-smuggling and anti-submarine missions in both the Atlantic and Pacific. Closer to the water, an MH-60R Seahawk flies lower and slower, ready to drop in behind the formation and shoot at engines, not people, stripping the fleet of its power one boat at a time. The arrangement looks almost like a net laid flat across the sea. Yet each asset has a precise role. The destroyer anchors the box. The literal combat ship covers the deep water. The cutters seal the flanks. The P-8 sees everything from above, and the Seahawk reaches out like a moving blade. For viewers used to fast action, it is easy to forget that this kind of trap exists to avoid uncontrolled chaos. If U.S. forces attack, while the cartel fleet is still spread out across the open Caribbean, every confrontation becomes more dangerous. A speedboat can charge a cutter, force warning shots, dump cargo near fishing grounds, or provoke a confusing chase at night. When firearms are involved and visibility is low, the risk to crews and even nearby civilians climbs. By contrast, inside the killbox, every factor tilts toward control. The reef corridor slows the water. The limited space narrows contact angles. The overlapping sensors reduce surprises. Even then, nothing is guaranteed, but the odds of stopping the fleet without a massacre increase sharply. That is why commanders are willing to wait, watching their screens as the radar tracks crawl closer to the invisible walls. However, there is still one variable no map can lock down: the human mind. All of this planning assumes that La Corona Del Mare will follow its usual route and sail straight into the corridor. If the cartel shifts course at the last minute, dives into deeper water, or hugs a different reef line, the perfect killbox could suddenly open into empty sea. But after all the planning, one question hung in the dark. Would La Corona Del Mare follow the predicted route and step into the trap? Or would 98 speedboats vanish into open water and leave the killbox empty? At exactly 2:48 a.m., the radar screens flickered and the formation began to reveal itself. 98 speedboats, each slicing across the pitch-black Caribbean water at 50 to 60 knots, adjusted course and carried a cargo the size of a small war. What they believed to be a clean run toward U.S. territory was, in fact, the final act of a prepared trap. Moments earlier, U.S. forces had laid the lines, and now the cartel fleet entered the narrowing sea corridor that led directly into the killbox. Through the night, a maritime patrol aircraft fed live video and sensor tracks back to the command center. The movement of the wedge-shaped fleet confirmed everything the planners had hoped. The Cartel was sailing straight into the net. At such speeds, the reaction time for chasing ships was nearly zero. A cutter or destroyer launched would reach the target only as the engines throttled up. The wake blurred and the position changed. The only way to succeed was to compel the adversary to enter a confined space where options vanished. By 4:12 a.m., all 98 boats had crossed the reef corridor and were inside the killbox. Picture a narrow rectangle in open water, walls of coral just beneath the surface, currents that push the boats into predictable paths, and overlapping sensor coverage from above in the sea. When every boat is inside that rectangle, the tactical advantage flips. The hunter becomes the trap setter, and then came the most dangerous moment of all. U.S. Navy SEALs, already aboard the destroyer and attached fast boats nearby, prepared to fast rope into the water, board central vessels, disable engines, and arrest key operators. The helicopters hovered above, spotlights carving through mist, while nearby cutters readied intercepting craft. And this was not a chaotic chase. It was a precision strike executed in layer after layer. At that fog-lit moment, the true gravity of the situation became clear. This wasn't simply a smuggling run gone wrong. It was a naval-style operation by a cartel, answered with a military-style response. Failure to stop 98 vessels at once, each capable of carrying dozens of crates of cocaine, could have meant a flood of illicit drugs reaching American shores unchecked. Yet even with the killbox engaged, nothing was simple. The planners had already accounted for speed, detection, pursuit. But what about unpredictability? What if the fleet turned early, bypassed the corridor, or split into smaller units? The trap works only when the adversary takes the path you expect. If the cartel deviated, the walls of the elevator would open, and the hunters could become prey. Nonetheless, through the quiet hours of the night, the operation held on. The destroyer's radar operators tracked the boats. The helicopter crew counted hulls in the moonlit trough. The SEALs waited with suppressed rifles and boarding lines. Every second ticked toward the moment of action. And as the fleet settled inside the killbox, the phase of interception shifted from observation to execution. By mastering geometry, speed, and surprise, U.S. forces transformed a high-stakes smuggling corridor into a battlefield zone. The next move would decide whether the cartel's fleet of 98 became another footnote, or whether it struck a blow that would reach far beyond the Caribbean horizon. The fleet was finally trapped, but one question hovered in the darkness. Once the killbox closed, how would U.S. forces strike 98 boats moving at full speed without turning the corridor into a massacre? Aboard the destroyer, an MH-60R Seahawk dipped low, its infrared camera lighting up holes in the night. Marksman locked on. The first engines exploded in sparks and flame, disabled before crews could react. Meanwhile, Navy SEALs fast roped into the center of the formation, light, fast boats darting alongside the trapped speedboats. Stun grenades bounced off hulls, precision rounds silenced exhausts, and intercept craft from Coast Guard cutters blocked every possible escape path. The mission's priority was not to destroy, but to disable and capture, a tactical choice that turned speedboats into silent hulks and crews into arrestees. The strategy highlights a simple truth. In maritime interdictions, U.S. forces aim first to stop, not kill, because arresting smugglers yields intelligence and disrupts networks more than sinking vessels alone. In this operation, the payoff was staggering. 41 boats were disabled, 39 captured intact, and the remaining 18 sunk or abandoned. Together, they held over 6,000 pounds of cocaine, plus sophisticated communications gear, navigation devices, and sat phones, a haul that underscored the seriousness of the threat. Real-world interdictions show seizures in the thousands of pounds, and here, the scale and coordination pushed the limits of what maritime forces can do. Those sea engines didn't just power fast boats, They powered a cartel's ambition, steering hundreds of millions of dollars in illicit drugs toward U.S. shores. The U.S. response showed how modern naval, air, and law enforcement assets can integrate in darkness, at speed, and with surgical precision. The destroyer provided the anchor, the helicopter and radar assets provided the eyes, the cutters and boarding teams provided the hand that closed the grip. When the fleet entered the killbox, the net snapped. Yet the most crucial moment came after the physical capture, when intelligence teams began unpacking the machines, the logs, the comms chatter hidden in those speedboats. Each device offered a key to larger networks. As the operation wound down and daylight crept into the Caribbean horizon, planners thought, "We have stopped 98 boats, but what lies behind them?" And it was the moment of transition, from chase to investigation. The question then became not simply who will face arrest, but what organization enabled this fleet, what routes they used, and how deep the corruption ran. In the coming hours, the Federal Bureau of Investigation would reveal that this was not a one-off show of force. It was exposure of a $100 million cocaine empire. But for the men and women who locked down the killbox, the victory was immediate, and the implications far-reaching. The seas were no longer a free highway for smugglers, and the message was clear. When you build a fleet to slip through the night, U.S. forces will build a trap to lock you in it. When U.S. forces boarded the last of the speedboats and dusk settled over the Caribbean corridor, the mode of action shifted instantly, from interception to investigation. As agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and allied agencies pored over satellite logs, radio chatter, and smuggled devices recovered from the seized hulls, a far broader picture emerged. The operation at sea had exposed a vast transnational network, moving not just drugs, but cash, vessels, and shell companies across oceans. The FBI's Counter-Organized Crime Unit defines these transnational criminal organizations as those that span borders, traffic narcotics, and launder money in an interconnected web. In this case, the cartel known as La Corona Del Mare had built more than a fleet. It had created a cargo logistics empire operating with the efficiency of a corporate supply chain. Evidence revealed that this network was structured almost like a private courier service for cocaine. Boats ran weekly routes, launches were timed to tides and currents, crews trained for stealth insertion. Behind them, finance and logistics cells held vaults of cash. Front companies rented yard space to refurbish composite hull speedboats. Offshore shell corporations undercut tax laws and masked payments. Intelligence articles note that drug trafficking organizations have evolved into business-like entities, using modern supply chain logic and money laundering techniques to reduce risk. La Corona Del Mare system functioned similarly to digital platforms such as Uber or DoorDash, but for illicit cargo. Coordinates were sent, arrival windows calculated, tracking signals monitored, and payments dispersed upon receipt. Such a system turns individual acts of smuggling into a regular industrial operation with predictable throughput and scale. Had the U.S. killbox operation not succeeded, reality likely would have looked very different. Some 6,000 pounds of cocaine, enough to flood markets and bolster profits well into 9 figures, were aboard those 98 boats, headed toward U.S. shores. Contemporary reports from the Coast Guard and other federal agencies show that each ton of cocaine carries street value potential of tens of millions of dollars once it enters domestic distribution chains. Without the trap, in the narrow reef corridor, the fleet could have sailed past detection, dispersed cargo, and vanished into local networks. Instead, by trapping the fleet and capturing discrete elements, the U.S. disrupted not just a load, but an entire method and supply chain logic. This moment marked a turning point. The action at sea revealed that intelligence and maritime forces were no longer facing isolated runs, but industrial-scale narcotics logistics. The challenge is no longer a single boat, but a fleet. No longer a hidden stash, but an open channel of global commerce built on violence and corruption. Analysts inside the FBI now voice concerns that the key to defeating such networks lies in understanding commerce-level operations, financial flows, front companies, digital scheduling, not just the vessels themselves. The implication for U.S. national security is profound. When criminal enterprises adopt business-like efficiency, they begin to rival legitimate logistics systems, challenge border controls, and embed themselves in local economies. And so, the twist emerges. This was not merely a dramatic interdiction at sea, it was the unraveling of a multi-million-dollar empire. From the deck of the destroyer to the wallets of shell companies, the U.S. discovered that the 98 speedboats were but the visible edge of a far deeper operation. But the key revelation came only at the end of the night. More important than the tonnage seized was the proof that the United States must track the architecture behind the smuggling, because once the architecture is known, future operations can be anticipated, disrupted, and shut down entirely. But if unraveling the $100 million empire exposed how deep the network ran, what did this entire operation ultimately reveal about the future of America's fight on the world's oceans? As the sun finally rose over the Caribbean corridor, the scale of what had unfolded became impossible to ignore. The cartel had advanced with the discipline of a small naval force, deploying a swarm of high-speed boats instead of a single vessel, a tactic that mirrors the evolution of real trafficking operations documented in U.S. maritime interdictions, where criminals increasingly rely on fast, low-profile craft to outrun patrols. In response, the United States pulled multiple agencies into one synchronized strike. Navy crews, SEAL teams, Coast Guard cutters, and FBI investigators worked as a single machine, proving that modern interdiction is no longer just a chase. It is a coordinated battle across sea, air, and intelligence networks. The killbox they built in the reef corridor embodies a core principle long emphasized in U.S. maritime strategy: win before the first shot is fired. By shaping the battlefield, predicting movement, and forcing the cartel fleet into a confined space, U.S. forces flipped the odds. Instead of confronting 98 speedboats scattered across open water, they faced a fleet trapped in a narrow window, where skill, technology, and planning held the advantage. Yet the larger message extends beyond this one fight. The threats facing the United States are changing shape. They no longer arrive only in hidden compartments or deep-diving submersibles, but in coordinated swarms designed to overwhelm sensors and surprise patrols. What has not changed is America's ability to adapt, combining military power, high-tech surveillance, and interagency cooperation to stay ahead on the world's most contested waters. And that leaves us with one final question. As cartels evolve, what new tricks will they deploy to slip past U.S. radar? Share your thoughts below. And if you want to dive deeper into the secrets shaping modern warfare, remember to subscribe to Military Power so you never miss the next breakthrough story.